Hello, everybody. Thanks for the wonderful introduction, Fabrice. I'm going to give you a brief overview of my background. Then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Product Next Acts, and I'll talk to you a little bit about what that is. And then hopefully I'll leave you with a recap of some interesting information that you can actually take back and apply to your day-to-day as product managers in your job. So first, a little bit about my background. I started as a product management intern during my secondary school. I actually got my degree in product management. I then went and actually got a doctorate in product management. And then straight from there, I ended up as head of product at Front. I'm sure this is very similar to your backgrounds. No, I'm just kidding. That does not happen at all. My path to product management looked a lot like this. I'm guessing everybody's path to product management looks like this. I actually started in finance. As Fabrice said, I quit. I did my own startup and started teaching myself how to code, and then one thing led to another. And I realized I was doing a lot of product work. I said, I love this. Maybe I should do this as a job, and continued on from there. And when I was looking at this crazy path, I was thinking, as Fabrice asked me, well, would you speak at La Product Conf? I said, what am I going to talk about, and what are the sort of key themes through my career that I had done? And I started thinking about it, and really, one thing that stood out to me is that each step in my career, I really worked on launching something brand new. And launching something that hadn't been done before at my company, or something brand new like a startup. And so what I'm going to talk to you about is Product Next Acts. I actually originally called this, I thought, I'm going to give this in Paris. It's going to be awesome. I'll call it Product Pas Deux. But then actually everybody told me that only Americans say Pas Deux. No French people actually say Pas Deux. So we're calling it Product Next Acts instead. And so let's take a look at some of the most famous Product Next Acts out there, and what am I actually even talking about? So a little computer company called Apple, about 10 years ago, decided that it wasn't going to be a computer company anymore, it was going to be a phone company. That's a huge next act, totally changed the trajectory of their company. Here's another one, a car company that was just sort of high-end black cars. They released something called UberX. It became a marketplace for drivers and passengers, completely changed the trajectory of their company. I was reading a magazine called Bloomberg Businessweek. I thought this was pretty interesting. This is a company, Gore-Tex. Many of you may have raincoats made of Gore-Tex. It's a breathable material that's used in many different places. But what you may not know is they're actually a material sciences company. So they're really good at fabricating plastics and things like that. And they are actually making a new cornea, so the outside of your eye, out of one of their materials that they discovered while they were researching a new type of raincoat. So totally different next act, something that maybe us in the tech world is a little bit less familiar with. This is one of my favorite ones. Amazon is probably the company known for next acts the most. This slide has about, 5 next acts, but maybe a couple to call out. They were a bookseller. This is a box of 1,000 nails that you can now get. Not only that, but it's not actually even sold by Amazon. So you can see it's sold by Blue Donuts or whatever that is. But that's Amazon Marketplace, completely unlocked, a huge new opportunity for them. And then finally, obviously, maybe the best known, I can get this box of 1,000 nails shipped to me in 2 days because of Amazon Prime, another huge next act for them. Some of next acts don't actually even have to be a product-based one. So this is Photoshop. And when I first started designing 20 years ago, I got Photoshop on a CD-ROM. And it was a perpetual license. I could use it whenever I wanted, for however long I wanted. And about 5 or 6 years ago, they actually changed that to a subscription model. So now it just costs me $20 a month, and for however long I have to pay, I just have to pay $20 a month. That's a huge next act for them. And even though the product is relatively similar, the actual format in which I get Photoshop has changed, and it took a lot of product work to actually make that happen. And so what does all this happen? One of the investors I really admire, Brian Schreier, actually showed me this. And what he said is that every good company is actually made up of lots of little next acts. not just one straight curve. There's no company that just launches and automatically grows exponentially like that, but it's actually made up of lots of little transitions where the growth actually steepens. They find something new, they find a new way to actually steepen that growth curve. And so this whole idea of next acts is actually incredibly important on how you grow your product. Your product's not just gonna grow exponentially and go sky high. What you're gonna need to do is keep finding out those inflection points and how to do that. And so as I said, when I look back through my career, what I realized is every point I'd really focused on one of these really important next acts. And at every point, I also learned an important lesson about maybe why it didn't work or what's a key there. And so what I'm actually gonna do is walk you through 4 different next acts that I tried to do and some of the learnings that I had with them. So let's take first Everlater. Everlater was my startup. I'm sure you all used it. It was the hottest thing in 2009, but if you didn't, this is a screenshot of it. It was a travel journal where you could plot where you went and then add photos, stories, any of your tips and tricks that you could add to it. And we were really happy about it. We launched, we raised venture capital, things were going well, but we sort of felt like we were on the very tail end of that blue curve. And the business felt about as big as that blue section right there. And we said, well, it might be time for our next act. And so we started looking at the business and we sort of thought, well, what could we do? And we started thinking. And one thing we noticed is that when people were logging their travel stories, many of them were going on trips with tour operators. So they were taking safaris, they were going on cruises, and we thought, these people are getting a lot of free advertising off our website. What if we made a marketing platform to tour operators? We could use our core technology. It would be an amazing next act. And that's exactly what we did. So we rolled out a product called Concourse. You can see the tour experience here on the left was the old way, and on the right was the new way. And it was, this amazing opportunity for them to log and record their travel experience. We tested with a few customers, and we thought this was awesome. It's going to be a great thing. But we missed one huge point. In our excitement, we thought great product fit, everything was going to go good. We didn't look at the market for tour operators on high-end tours. And what we realized is these tour operators actually have really small market. Their budgets are super tight, and they're not tech savvy, and so the sales cycle is going to be super slow. And what that all meant is it really wasn't a viable market for our product. And you're probably sitting there like, Nate, of course, everybody needs to think about the market. But it's shocking the number of startups I mentor where they're really excited, they've found initial product market fit, but the market just isn't big enough to actually make a difference to their business, whether they're starting something new or whether they're starting something in addition to their existing company. You still have to pay attention to that viable market. And just because you can build it doesn't necessarily mean you should build it. And that was a really important lesson number 1. Fortunately, right about that same time, we met an American company called MapQuest, who was looking for their own next step and actually acquired my startup. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second, but for many of you, you probably aren't familiar with MapQuest. MapQuest is the original site for driving directions. So it came out in the 1990s. People would put their points in, and they would actually print out physical papers that gave them the driving directions for each step. It was a huge company. It actually sold for $1 billion in 1999 to AOL. So it was this huge success. This is what it looks like today. But the problem was there was a company called Google who also decided maps were going to be really valuable, who made a product called Google Maps in about 2005. And by the time I joined, this is what MapQuest traffic looked like. And I joined right at the end of that graph. And so instead of the graph going up, it had been going down for a really long time. And this is another company who felt, for a different reason, that they needed a big next act from a product perspective. And when they saw Everlater, what they had decided was that they were going to become a travel company, not a mapping company. And they saw people are driving, they're going on vacations, they're getting directions to their vacations, they're getting directions to their hotels. We're going to become a travel company. And so they acquired us, and I took over running product there. And so I first said, well, okay, the first thing I learned from Everlater is if you're going to do a next act, it has to be a viable market. And so I started thinking and looked into it, and many of you work in online advertising. You know that travel is one of the most lucrative spaces for online advertising. MapQuest was basically an advertising company. And I said, okay, well, there's certainly a viable market if we can make this work. So we sat down. I think this was launched a month after I joined. It was called MapQuest Discoverer, and you can see it was very rich, very immersive, lots of ideas in terms of travel inspiration and things to do and places you could actually travel. So we launched it, and you can pretty much guess what happened. The site did not work. And it didn't work because we missed a key fact here. And that was that most of the people on MapQuest were looking for a convenience store or their doctor's office or something, very basic and local. And what they'd found when we directed them to the new MapQuest Discoverer is something like this. Like, we know you were looking for your doctor's office, but would you like to look at this amazing 5-star hotel? And I was thinking, like, how do I describe the way the user was feeling? And I really felt like this GIF actually like summed it up. They're like, okay, I got it. Like, whoa, what the heck? Like, this is crazy. Like, what are you trying to make me do here? And it really taught me something really important, which I'll call the adjacent possible. And the adjacent possible is actually a term from evolutionary biology. And the idea behind the adjacent possible in evolutionary biology is that it wasn't just one random gene mutation and suddenly like an eye popped out. Like, that just didn't happen. And what instead happened is lots of like small things that happened in a chain that were all adjacent to each other. The eye wasn't possible at that point in time. And, it's not, this is a 3-eyed fish, and that eye just didn't pop out. It was a membrane that formed, then the cornea formed, then small light receptors happened, then the lens started forming, and then over 1 million years or 2 million years, suddenly an eye developed. And so what does that mean in product terms? So in product terms, I believe adjacent means it has to be related to the current customer need. And clearly, at MapQuest, we'd failed that. People were coming for their doctor's office. They were getting this travel inspiration stuff, and it just wasn't actually related to the current customer need that they were coming for. And then possible means it has to be feasible. And that was another problem. We had no experience as a travel company at MapQuest. So all of the DNA was in routing and maps, but nobody actually knew how to do travel booking or any of the core competencies that would be required to actually make a great travel experience. And so even though we had a viable market, we did not have the adjacent possible. And MapQuest Discoverer actually got removed in about 4 months. So it was a terrible disaster and a huge lesson for me on terms of how do you launch your next steps. After a few years, I actually got recruited by Airbnb. Finally, it's probably a company that you know. But when you go all the way back to the beginning of Airbnb, Airbnb originally was just a place where you could rent an air mattress or a couch. This is actually the Airbnb website from 2009, I think. And over time, this is 2013, they'd advanced and now you could rent castles or yurts or any of these specialty lodging. You could get an entire place. And actually, by the time I joined, they had so many new next acts, things like professional photography, host guarantee. Whole books have been written on all of the different levers that they'd pulled and features that they'd launched in order to get that growth curve to go up. But obviously, being a huge company with huge ambition, when I joined, they wanted to hit that next inflection point. And Brian, the CEO, had a huge vision which would totally change the way that company worked, which was, we shouldn't just be a homes company. We should be a company that actually provides the entire trip. And this was a huge vision. I think this is the type of vision you need to actually have that next inflection point. And so we sat down and said, okay, well, what's the first product we could launch on this? And we actually decided Airbnb Experiences. So I started on a team of about 7 people, and we started iterating and building this product called Airbnb Experiences. And obviously, the first thing I did was I sat down in my checklist and I said, okay, well, does it have a viable market? And I think the answer is absolutely. Tours and experiences is a huge market. People say 30 billion. Some people say it's even as big as 100 billion a year. It's a massive market. The second thing, as obviously I just learned that it has to be part of the adjacent possible, is it part of the adjacent possible for Airbnb? And people were already coming to book their home. They were already looking for things to do on their trip, and they were messaging their host, what are the great things that I can do here? And so it seemed like it also checked the adjacent possible. It was definitely related to the current customer need, and Airbnb is anything if not one of the best marketplace businesses out there. We knew we could actually make a marketplace out of experiences too, and so it felt like it checked both those boxes, and so I said, let's do it, let's go for it, and go. So we really wanted to iterate in secret, and so we said, shh, we're gonna launch secretly. We called it City Hosts. We tested with very few people because we wanted to keep this huge launch a surprise, and it was a huge launch. So this is Brian on stage introducing to people to a world of trips. It was amazing. Everybody was really excited. And what we launched with was these experiences that were very immersive. So here's an example. I actually went on this one, Quinn the Adventure Man. It was 3 days long. You learned how to surf. You did a couple of surf experiences, and it was very in-depth over 3 days, $350. But we missed a key factor here. And when we launched these, very few people bought them. And it was a huge disappointment. We'd had this massive launch. The vision was great. We knew we'd hit it just adjacent possible. But we missed a key factor, and that is that we didn't iterate with customers. And if we'd iterated with customers, what we would have quickly realized is that people already had their trip purpose designed. They didn't have 3 days to actually fill with a blank space with one of these immersions. They were already going to see the city. They already had plans with friends. They were going to visit family. What they did have, though, is a free afternoon or a free morning, or maybe they even had a couple free mornings and afternoons that they wanted to combo together. And so fortunately, we had an amazing user research team at Airbnb. We were able to sit down with customers, quickly figure out the problem. And now if you look at Airbnb Experiences, most of the inventory looks a lot more like this. 3 hours, $100, something that you can easily fit into a block in your trip. And the good news, as opposed to Everlater and MapQuest, is that Airbnb Experiences is actually working. There's no publicly released numbers, but I think somebody said that it's grown 7x in the last year. And so this one, I think, we're actually have a good trajectory, and it's actually working. But around that same time, I met Mathilde, who is the CEO of Front. I fell in love with the company, and so I joined Front as the head of product. Many of you probably know Front. It's a French company, and it's amazing. They started out as just being a shared inbox. So this is one of the screenshots from the very beginning of Front. And what Front allowed you to do is take a single inbox like sales at or support at and have multiple people access that mailbox at one time. And it was a great product, definitely hit product market fit. What Front realized at that point in time is, okay, now that we have all these people in here, we need to add workflows on top of that shared inbox. So they rolled out collaboration, automation, context on top of it. And by the time I started joining, this is actually a slide from the Series B deck they used to raise their funding. I saw this slide, I said, one, they clearly already have a vision of product next acts, but two, they had some pretty big ambitions for what they wanted to do next. And on this curve, as you see, they started with shared email addresses, they moved to collaborative communication, and what was next is they had an ambition to become not just a shared inbox company, but a company that could do shared and individual email as well. This is a big change for the company, so I started obviously going through my checklist. I said, one, is this a viable market? I clearly thought it was a viable market. There's only 1 billion email users there at work, and so that seemed like a great market to go into. Two, did it hit the adjacent possible? And the adjacent possible here was very obvious. People are already in Front for their shared inbox. They'd actually been asking to use their individual inbox in Front, and so it seemed like something that clearly met the mark on adjacent possible. But the next question was, did we actually have the right system to iterate with our customers? And fortunately, Front is an incredibly customer-centric company, and not only that, but Front uses Front to do this exact thing, which is iterate with customers. So at Front, when we receive customer feedback, everybody in the company can actually see it. So I see hundreds of customer feedbacks a week. When we get those customer feedbacks, the product team actually tags that in Jira. You can tag it in Asana or anywhere else, but you'll actually be able to link that customer conversation or the original customer need to a ticket in Jira. Then we can actually look in aggregate, okay, what are the total number of customer conversations about this particular issue? So when you're thinking about individual email, things that jumped right out of the page were people really wanted calendar. That surprised us a lot. Like, well, with calendar, it's not totally linked to email, but what we realized is everybody uses calendar and email together. Another one we didn't have was folders. So many people relied on folders. And if you come from Gmail, you might not rely so much on folders, but if you're an Outlook user, you rely a lot on folders. And so these are the types of things that bubbled to the top. And as we fixed the items, we were actually able to respond to the customer, because every time we closed one of the Jira tickets, all of the emails would reopen in our sales team and our customer success team's inboxes, and we're actually able to complete that loop with the customer. And of course, when you respond to a customer, even if it's 3 or 4 months later, and say, hey, we just shipped the feature you requested, they love it, they give you more feedback, and you're actually able to elicit more customer feedback from the customer themselves. So here's a screenshot. You can see this is just tagging a Jira issue right in front. It made it so easy. And so I felt, okay, we're definitely going to iterate well with customers. We'd launched ahead of time. This was one of those things where we could build it up and actually sort of grab some of these big issues. And so I felt very confident about launching into this new market. We introduced brand new Front. It had many of the features that customers had requested and that we'd been iterating live with them on. We'd hit all of the check boxes. And this was our NPS. I think you guys know where this story is going. Even when you roll out something new, many of you are in SaaS, people hate change. So we figured, NPS would drop a little bit. But unfortunately, NPS dropped a lot. And, we'd clearly missed some things. And it led me to maybe the most important lesson of all around Product Next Acts. And that is, stick to your guns. We went back, we continued to iterate, we filed more Jira tickets. I think in the 2 months after launch, we took care of 800 different customer issues through this system. And the great news is NPS has totally rebounded. And that really led me to the final lesson that I learned, which is even if you get everything else right, starting a next act takes a ton of persistence. You can't just assume that you're going to roll it out, hit the mark on the first time. No one does that. And I thought through my career, and all of these things take a ton of persistence. And the great news is, this is actually individual inbox users right after the launch. You can see it totally took off. It's a great success for us. If you're looking for a new email program, I highly recommend you check it out. But I think the great news for us is that following that system, iterating with the customers actually did confirm that we had hit the mark on this product. So again, just to recap all of the things that I've talked about, first is Product Next Acts are a really impactful way to change your business. Other companies have done it, iPhone, Amazon, and really, in my opinion, every company needs a whole bunch of Product Next Acts in order to actually grow and become that exponential growth. You can't just do it in one product, clean sweep. It's always going to be a layer upon layer of new invention, new things that you're testing out and launching to really make it happen. The 4 lessons that I learned: viable market, adjacent possible, iterate with customers, and persistence. When you take that, number 1, viable market, just because you can build it and because you have a few customers interested doesn't mean you should. Please make sure that you look deeply, assess that not just a few customers, but that it's really worth building. It's going to actually make a material difference and change that growth trajectory of your company. The second is the adjacent possible. So just because it's a new market doesn't necessarily mean it's related enough to the users you have today and that there's a big enough link that they'll automatically follow you to that next place. Don't try to make them jump over that subway track. Just make sure that they can figure out what's going on, that it's related to their need, and that you have the capabilities to actually build that. The third is iterate with customers. Make sure that you're actually doing this live with customers. Big, quiet launches are awesome for the PR, but it's so difficult to actually get it right with your actual customers and find out all the nuances that's going to make your product successful. And just like Airbnb Experiences, you may have an amazing idea, you may have an amazing market, but you miss something huge like the fact that all of your experiences are 3 days and when they should be at 3 hours. And that's something that you can totally avoid by iterating live with your customers. And then finally, persistence. Know your product process, keep at it. even when it feels like it's not going to work, continue to push through, and oftentimes it will. It just takes iteration and practice and persistence and discipline. And if you do that, so many good things can happen. I hope your businesses all can go from something looking like this to something looking like that. I'm Nate Abbott. Thank you so much for being here, and hopefully you learned something.
So thank you, Nate. We have several questions. The first one is a bit harsh, actually.
I love it. I would expect nothing less from the French.
Of course. Why is Google not following your rules as they fail with every new product they do?
Well, I think there could be a lot of reasons, and I think we could probably take each one and figure out, well, did they not iterate? Is it not there? But a lot of the Google products, I think, and one of the challenges about Google is they really stretch to do the adjacent possible. So a lot of the features and things they're doing, what does self-driving cars have to do with search? And I think that's something tough, right? You're really actually building a brand new company. You're not really doing a next act of your existing company. And I think that's one of the challenges they have. But again, my guess is, and we could dissect each one of their different products and when they launched and they failed and why did they fail. And my guess is one of the four things that I mentioned, or maybe multiple of them, didn't happen. I think maybe the other thing I've observed is that I think, especially big companies, I don't think this is just Google, and we won't just pick on Google, but I think a lot of companies fail on the fourth one, which is persistence. So it's so easy to get excited as a big company. It's so easy to do a big launch. But what's really hard as a big company is to stick through that sort of like messy middle phase where it's not really a success and you haven't totally figured it out, but there's some signs of life. And I think to continue to fund the growth through that cycle is really challenging.
Lovely. Are there second act successes that did not follow your rules?
I mean, I'm sure there are. And I hope as I go in through my career, I hope to have lots of further next acts. And I'm sure I'll discover new rules that I haven't experienced today. And so if you have rules that you've learned that I didn't mention, please email me. I would love to know about them. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just some key rules that I've found that I follow. But I think launching any product is difficult, even if it's an iteration on an existing product. But obviously a next act and something that's a brand new market or something that's totally different or going to pivot the business in a new way is much harder because there's less of a base or a foundation that you're going to launch on. And so I'm sure there's more things. I totally encourage you to come tell me what I'm missing so I can avoid another disaster in my future.
Is there any difference switching B2C to B2B on your next act process?
B2C and B2B, I think, do have definite differences. B2B has the advantage that generally you're dealing with fewer customers, so you can be more intimate with them. You can really listen and respond. At Airbnb, we had 20,000 support agents. It was almost impossible to think about like a system that we had at Front, where you could tag each issue with a Jira ticket or something like that. So I think B2B allows you to be more intimate with your customer. But I think in broad terms, B2B and B2C aren't that different. And the reality is, in both cases, you still need to be part of the adjacent possible. If you're with a B2B company and you launch something totally new that your users don't get, they won't pay for it. If you launch in B2C, your users just won't come back or they'll bounce. Same if you don't iterate with customers. In either case, you're liable to miss the mark. And so I think, by and large, I think there's more similarities than differences in B2B and B2C.
Okay. I got a mix too, which is how can you maintain persistence when it's just not working, and when do you stop to keep trying?
I think that's a great question. You could ask if we kept going with MapQuest Discover, would it have suddenly worked? And I think the answer that I came to is absolutely not. And a little bit of it comes to, are you really confident that you hit the first two right? Is this a real customer need that's related to something that they're already doing? And is it a big market? And if it is, then in my opinion, keeping iterating with your customers, keep trying is something that you should do, and you should push probably a little bit further than it feels right to do. It's much easier to just say, it's not going to work. It's much harder to say, no, let's keep trying, let's keep going a little bit further. And I think I would recommend that if you're really sure that the product is there, that the market's there, and that it's really linked with what you're already doing, that you should keep persisting longer than you feel like you should. Because I see so many people quit before they should, and probably left a good product on the table.
Why should I be using Front?
Why should I be using Front? I would love to give you a sales pitch. I think it'll make, I think the biggest thing about Front from a product perspective, especially from a B2B use case, is that it allows you to link what the customers are coming in and telling you and that your customer-facing teams are using, and it actually allows you to link that directly to your product process. And so often I see people like, oh, do you talk to your users? And they're like, yeah, I talk to them once a week, it's great. I'm like, what do you do? And they're like, well, I take great notes. I'm like, well, when you do something with that, do you tell them? And you're like, well, it's tough to remember because 3 months later I did something and I couldn't quite remember which customer it was. And I think actually building a system around that, whether it's Front or whether you do something else, is incredibly important. I think Front allows you to actually do that in a systematic way with your customer-facing teams. But you can use any tool, but making sure you have something where you can actually close the loop in a systematic way. You can actually aggregate and measure which requests are the most important, which bugs are people complaining about the most, and actually have a systematic way of addressing those and then responding to customers is so, so important. And I think Front, I wrote a LinkedIn post on this, is the best way I found to do it. It's totally changed my product process having been at Front and using Front. But as long as you have some tool where you're confident that you're actually doing that iteration cycle, then I think you can have real success doing product. And so I don't want to pitch Front specifically, but I do think that making sure you can close that loop between your customers, whether you do it in aggregate, whether you're doing it one-on-one, is so, so important.
So very critical questions. Which shampoo do you use?
Which shampoo? It's an American brand. No, it was what was ever at my Airbnb this morning. I can't tell you, and it probably was a French brand of shampoo, but
should a good one. Well, how do you apprehend NPS then? When to choose whether to follow your guts or act based on it?
NPS is really tough, and I think I could have just told you a success story. Individual users went up and just buried the fact that our NPS did go down. I think NPS in of itself is not a very useful metric. Like somebody will come to me and they'll be like, oh, my NPS is 70, and I'll ask them and I'll be like, okay, well, how do you measure that? And they're like, well, whenever they complete something really successful or take a really great action, then we pop up a survey that's like, hey, would you recommend this? And people answer yes. I'm like, well, of course they answer yes. You just caught them right when they were super happy about your product rather than the overall experience. And so what I actually think NPS is useful for is not judging whether you're doing better than another company or something like that, but what NPS is really good at telling you is if your attitudes of your users have changed. And so it's really obvious on that chart that people don't like change. We'd messed up some of the features that they used, and it was really obvious from the feedback where we'd screwed up, and it was easy for us to actually make moves and push that NPS back up. And I think that's where NPS is very helpful, is actually telling trends in your own user base. It's not, otherwise it's just a vanity metric. Anybody can game NPS. I don't think NPS in of itself is very useful, but I do believe measuring the change for your own sake in NPS is incredibly useful and something that you can actually use as a tool to measure the attitudes of your users and whether they're happy or not.
How do you manage to take your 4 steps process when the company is led by a stubborn exec team?
Stubborn executives, I've never worked for a stubborn executive. I don't know anything. I don't know what you guys are talking about.
Happy man.
I think, look, this process, whatever the executive is, and there's a whole nother talk on what you should build or how do you convince people that you need a next step. But I think my experience, even with executives that have been very stubborn, is that everybody wants to move the business forward somehow. And generally, when I hear somebody say it's stubborn, it's because I disagree with the way that we should move forward, or the exec and I disagree on what that path forward is, and I'm like, no, I'm right, and he's like, or she's like, no, she's right, and it just becomes this mess. And so For me, when you're moving the business forward, even if it's not the product that I wanted to build, and I can tell you, I wasn't super optimistic of, say, about MapQuest Discover. I was kind of like, I don't know. But, I had an exec that was very sure that this is the right thing. And so we pushed forward. And I think you can use these 4 steps even when it's a product that you're not totally sure about. And you can also use it to say, hey, I don't think this product's going to work. Like, a great conversation point is not, I think your product idea is stupid and we shouldn't build it, but it's, hey, have we looked at the market? Or, hey, I'm not sure it's totally related to our current customer needs. Can we do some user research to see if people's taste would actually help there? Or, gee, I agree with you that this is the right product to build, but I really don't want to build this in total silence with no user research. Can we figure out a beta program where we approximate what the product is going to be, and so that we can actually iterate with our customers live? And I think those are the good conversations that you can have with the stubborn executive to actually unstick them and actually ground them a little bit more in a rational discussion rather than an emotional discussion.
If you're looking for your second act, is the risk to neglect the current problems of your customers?
Absolutely, and I think one of the big points about adjacent possible is that if you pick something so far from your existing user need that it's going to be a risk that your users aren't going to understand it, but B, it's going to be so separate that you're not going to be able to remember or pay attention to your current product. But I also think that regardless of what happens when you look at companies, as they grow, they need to be able to find ways and systems to maintain focus among more things, right? So when you take a company like Airbnb, which is huge, 150 product managers, even something like Google or Facebook with thousands of product managers, those companies have so many next acts. We had a PM working on Superhost. We even had a PM just working on the login experience at Airbnb. And one of the things we needed to do is figure out a system for goals and system for accountability such that all of these disparate next acts were actually adding up to something that actually made the company as a whole respond to user needs and make sure that we were taking care of everyone there. And I saw the other talk tracks. I think some other folks are talking about goals, talking about OKRs. And I hope that they're going to talk a little bit about how do you make sure that you set up a system where you can focus on more than one thing at a time. Because I think as your company grows, you have to be able to do that. It's a competence that everybody needs.
So it's pretty easy in retrospect, in a way, to have the criteria that would make success. But at the time of the failures, how could you have known?
Well, I couldn't have, or I would have stopped the failures. I think all the other thing, and it's been written so much, but fail fast is one of the mottos of tech and comes out of Silicon Valley all the time. It's almost a joke at this point in time. But I think you can't be afraid to fail. If you're afraid to fail, then you'll never try a next act. And I can tell you I've failed a lot in my career, and I've still become relatively successful. And so I think it's really important to not worry about, am I going to fail? I don't totally know. I've never tried this before. And instead just jump in, figure it out, take learnings, write me what you learned so I can incorporate it into my talk in the next time. And I think that cycle is very important. It's one of those things where you'll never know until you do it. And then you'll probably learn something totally new. And a lot of the learnings today I would have never done if I'd never just gone and tried it myself.
Why did you leave Airbnb?
I left Airbnb because I met Mathilde, and if any of you have met her, she's an amazing leader of Front, and I really fell in love with the way she was leading the company. And also, once I started understanding the product, I started seeing an opportunity where you take a product that's growing incredibly fast, and you look at a market like email, which has, as I said, has 1 billion users and really hasn't had any innovation since 2001 or 2002 when Gmail released archiving and threading. And you put all of that together, and I felt like it was an opportunity that I couldn't miss. And I was really excited to sort of go lead product there and see what we could make Front. And it's been a wonderful decision for the past year. I have zero regrets. Well, I love Airbnb. Many of my best friends still work there, so it was a tough decision.
How do you work with your French colleagues in Paris at Front? What changes between the American way and the French way of doing product?
Well, my boss is French. I work with lots of French people. I think for me, I've always been a big fan of diversity. And so making sure that your teams are diverse, both with genders, with cultures, with races. And I think the more diversity you have, the more interesting ideas you get, and the better your product becomes. And so I think diversity, both in your team and your company, is incredibly important. And I think one of the fun things is having an office or a company that spans two different cultures, like French and English, actually makes us a lot better. So we get different ideas, different ways of thinking from both folks on the American side, both folks on the French side, and all of those actually make us stronger. I think, obviously, we have cultural awareness trainings. People work a little bit different in France or have different attitudes. I think feedback is much more direct here in France, and so for people starting, it can be like, "Whoa, this is really harsh." And friends are like, "Hey, man, this is how we do it."
That's not true.
Yeah, I'm waiting for you to critique my talk afterwards.
I will.
But I think overall, having multiple offices and different people and different cultures is so helpful and makes us a better company.
Okay, so there was the last question actually, which was how do you go about differentiating between what the clients needs and what they think they need? But I guess if you're interested about that question, you should come to the next talk of Angie Bourne, because she really talks about that. Thank you a lot, Nate.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
If you want to talk to Nate, he'll be around, and you can use Swapcard to ping him, so do not hesitate.